So let's begin. Good morning. I am welcoming you to the webinar of the Center for Migration Studies at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. And today our guest is Professor Anne White from University College London. She will give a talk entitled Poland as a Country of Immigration and Emigration, Ukrainian Factory Workers' Perspectives on Life and Work in Kalisz and Płock. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Anne White. She is a MB Grabowski Professor of Polish Studies at the University College London School of Slavonic and East European Studies. I know Anne also as the organizer of the Polish migration website, which is a great resource for anyone who is interested in migration to Poland and from Poland. And also I would like to add that from January to June 2022, she is a NAWA Ulam Scholar based in the Center for Migration Studies. And she is continuing her research in Poland. She is interested mostly in smaller places. Our last webinar in December 2021 concerned Ukrainian migration in Poznań, and today we move to smaller Polish cities like Kalisz and Płock. Let me introduce myself. My name is Izabela Mine, and I will convene this meeting. And the last technical question and request, please turn off your microphones. So there will be first the lecture, and then we will have time for questions and answers. So again, welcome, Professor Anne White. Thank you for sharing your research findings with us today. And Professor White, the floor is yours. So please start.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I hope you can see my screen okay. Is it all right?
Yeah, it's well.
Okay, good. So it's really lovely to be in Poznań, and thank you very much for inviting me to be at your Centre for Migration Studies. It's a great honour, and it's lovely to be back in Poznań. My research I'm presenting today is 2/3 of my current research project, because I'm looking at 3 cities. Today I'm going to be talking about Kalisz and Płock. The picture, and thank you very much to Marta, by the way, for helping to organise this webinar. Marta chose this picture, which is actually a very apt one. This is Kalisz, and it shows the cathedral, but they also have Ukrainian masses there at 2 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. So it's quite important from that point of view. Sorry, I'm trying to get this thing to move. Okay, here we are. So this is part of my wider project, which is called Poland as a Country of Immigration and Emigration. And that is quite a good title in Polish. It's not so good in English, because in English, immigration and emigration tends to convey the idea of permanent settlement, either in the new country or else going abroad to live somewhere permanently. And I'm not talking about permanence here, but something which is rather hard to define. So what I'm interested in is a bottom-up view of Poland's migration transition. So Poland is receiving more and more migrants, and it can now be labelled a receiving country, to use the migration jargon. But what is Poland? Obviously, it's a construct, and a pretty complicated one. So Poland, as far as one of the things I'm looking at is like how Poland is constructed on a city level. And I'm looking at 3 Polish cities. I did some work in Płock in 2019. Then there was an enforced break, which is very unfortunate, makes things harder to compare. Last autumn, I was in Kalisz. I was in Kalisz last weekend, tomorrow as well, and then I'm going to be doing Piła. Now, these 3 cities are quite different from each other in many ways, but they have certain similar features. They're all regional capitals. Until 1998, they're in central and western Poland. They're roughly the same size, although 100,000, give or take, 10, 20,000 either way. And they have increasingly a migrant population. And in each city, I've been doing 45 to 50 interviews with migrants and return migrants. I also do observation, and I have conversations with local experts, like people working in NGOs or the job centre. So my main research question is what happens when societies with continuing strong habits of out-migration become receiving societies. So if we look at this business about the migration transition more generally, clearly many countries have made this migration transition to becoming receiving countries. And there seem to be certain patterns, particularly that after a while, the migrants who typically are temporary to start off with, and just like often it's just the man who comes, then he invites his family and then people begin to settle. So that's the kind of second stage when there's family reunification and settlement. But I think it's a bit different in the 21st century. And in my book about Polish families and migration, I argued strongly that this pattern is very much speeded up in the 21st century. So sometimes it can be just 6 months, for example, before the family joins the original migrant. And this is because in general, there's faster networking, people can exchange information, they can make inspection visits and so forth. And so you might say that there's more mobility nowadays, and people often do, but it also means there can be more settlement because people can make up their minds quicker that they want to settle. So in this particular presentation, I'm looking at one particular theme for my research. So I'm looking at my Ukrainian sample. They're my largest group of non-Polish interviewees, although I also have other people like a Venezuelan, a Nigerian, various people. But I have this largest group of Ukrainians. I'm looking at how they make their decisions about migration, but also how these decisions are affected by the fact that they live in places where many Polish people have experience of migration. I'm not going to look at why they don't want to go back to Ukraine. Well, this is quite important in my research. It's just a question of time. So my paper today is about their thoughts about Poland, understood on that sub-national level. And I'm arguing that part of the reason why they make certain decisions is that they receive messages from local Poles who are somehow expert in migration. And the approach I take in all my research is to use a livelihood strategy approach. So my interviews typically involve discussing with people like why they made certain decisions, not other ones like, well, why did you come to Poland instead of going to Kiev, for example. So I want to understand how people choose between different livelihood options, partly for economic reasons, but also sort of how they understand economic reasons, the meanings they attribute to those, and also definitely non-economic factors. And the non-economic factors include the norms and assumptions prevailing in certain places, like should women with very young children migrate on their own, for example. So often there can be quite strong norms against that. But at the same time, these norms and beliefs do change. And I think you can say that migration cultures do evolve in both Ukraine and Poland quite quickly. So like Morawska and Horvat, I use the term migration culture quite widely to refer to local beliefs about migration and how to do it. And this migration culture is particular to certain localities, but also there's a kind of sort of shared migration culture between people from different backgrounds, and particularly at work, I think, where Ukrainians are mingling with Poles. So they swap ideas and they swap stories. For example, people who've migrated through agencies often tell stories about unreliable agencies, their own or other people's. These are almost like urban myths about agencies which let you down. And these often somehow reinforce people's view that somehow if you know somebody quite well, it's much better to use them to migrate, even if just to check the reliability of a particular agency. So they reinforce a kind of sense that migration should be done, if possible, using your informal resources and networks. About Ukrainians in Poland, well, there's plenty of scholarly literature on this topic now, which is really interesting and quite wide-ranging. It's mostly by Polish and Ukrainian scholars. It shows certain recent trends, increasing diversity of the Ukrainian population in Poland, people from different social backgrounds, different ages, different levels of education. It shows that there is more process towards settling. And it also shows that Ukrainians are spreading throughout Poland to different locations. There's a small literature comparing these different destinations in Poland, and it shows that the destination does matter. For example, Górny et al. Show that Ukrainians in Warsaw do quite a wide range of jobs, and in provincial destinations, factories may be more important. There's also a small literature on Polish attitudes towards Ukrainians, which suggests that quite a lot of Poles have a rather instrumental attitude. They like the idea of labour migrants because they're useful to Poland. Obviously, there are also Polish nationalists who are quite hostile on sort of ideological grounds, historical grounds. There is another smallish literature about how Ukrainians relate to other Ukrainians, which I think is really interesting, and I do study that because it does have implications for where people decide to settle, but I'm not talking about it today. So this is my sample so far. So these I've finished interviewing Ukrainians in Kalisz and also obviously in Płock. So as you'll see, the majority of them were factory workers, although others had other jobs. What is very striking is that the people I interviewed in autumn last year were predominantly with their partner or spouse. Two of these were Polish partners, the rest were Ukrainians. There were a number of children, adult children, who had joined their parents. And this is a very small sample, and my method is sort of anthropological, so I'm not producing statistics, so I'm not going to say that, this shows that there is definitely a trend towards family reunification, but it does point out that within my sample, I have more reunified people in 2021 than in 2019. But as I said, the COVID enforced break makes comparison a bit difficult. It's very striking that only 1 out of my entire sample of 55 was intending definitely to return to Ukraine permanently. Finally, they came from every part of Ukraine, from Kiev down to small villages, and from all different locations, east and west and south and north. And when I've given them pseudonyms, and I've to some extent tried to reflect their background as Ukrainian or Russian speakers by their names. And I did the interviews, well, I spoke Russian or Polish, and they spoke to me in Russian, Polish, or Ukrainian, or a kind of mix, which was quite fun. Anyway, so that's my sample. And then I just want to say a little bit about the perils of doing this kind of interview. Obviously, it is much, much better to live in a place and have lots of informal conversations, because these are very complex matters. So from that point of view, my week-by-week fieldwork in the UK with Poles living in my hometown is much more reliable in terms of providing evidence about people's evolving thoughts on whether to stay and why to stay. But if you do just one interview, then you often find that people do contradict themselves, which is quite intriguing, perhaps predictable. Quite often people would start off by talking about why they came to Kalisz or Płock, and they would assert that they wanted to stay. For example, Galina said, "I see my future in Poland 1,000,000%. But then later on I would say, well, have you thought about moving on to Germany or somewhere? What are your thoughts for the future? And then it would change a bit. So like Galina said, somehow I liked Germany. And I said, so what do you like in Poland? And she says, it's become a bit too ordinary. Can't see any dividing line between Ukraine and Poland. So, people obviously have very complicated thoughts. It's a very important thing for people to decide where they want to live, and particularly if they're going to bring over their children, they have to make the right decision. So these are complex things, and you have to look at all the different factors which influence people, both things about the place where they are, but also things about their personal identities and priorities. And that was the approach I took in my book about Polish families, and it's my approach now as well. So looking at my presentation structure, I'm starting off by looking at the external influences, so the city, factory, the Polish friends and acquaintances. I should say that these are very often, these are sort of znajomi, rather than sort of real close friends. And then local Ukrainians, their example. And then the sort of individual factors, the factors that refer to individual people I interviewed, where they came from in Ukraine, their ethnic identity, if they're at all Polish, their gender, life stage, age, and the linguistic confidence and knowledge. The picture, incidentally, shows the Wisła in Płock. So Płock is quite a nice place in many ways. And I'm turning now to the cities. So I said to several people, like, you know, how did they feel about Kalisz? And well, I asked them all about it. And several people replied, I like Kalisz because it's like Lviv. And on my picture, you will see the ratusha in Lviv, so the town hall in Lviv and then in Kalisz. And the one in Kalisz was actually built in the 1920s as a kind of mock, but people thought that Kalisz was sort of old, like Lviv. And they would make these comparisons, even though obviously Kalisz is much, much smaller. This is important in understanding how people think. The city's capacities to attract and keep migrants could be seen in terms of their place in various rankings, but it's actually much more subjective than that. So there are lots of statistics and rankings. You can find these in various geographical texts in Polish newspapers, etc., etc. Normally what happens is that Płock is quite high, Kalisz is a bit further down, and Płock is a little further down than that, but not near the bottom. But, you know, well, there are only statistics. Maybe they mean something, they do mean something, clearly, some of them. But in the end, I don't think people choose the city because of the number of kilometres of cycle paths, for example. And even if you look at things like average wages, you know, in Płock, they seem quite high because of Orlen, but most people don't work at Orlen. So if you look at migrants have their own points of comparison. And I've argued elsewhere that somehow making comparisons is the key identity of the migrant. Migrant can make comparisons between places. That's what they know how to do. And you know, if you're a migrant living in Płock or Kalisz, quite often you've worked somewhere else in Poland first, and you know that you prefer Kalisz to Warsaw or Wrocław or wherever. You had a worse experience of working in those cities, or sometimes a better one, so that you can make those comparisons. And then also, people also have friends. So because there are so many Ukrainians in Poland, you know, some Ukrainian people buy cars and they go and they visit their friends who are just living in other cities. So quite a few people I interviewed had got quite a few points of comparison, again, particularly in Kalisz, actually. So they could say that they liked Kalisz better than Poznań because it's curious how when you ask people about their migration and they make comparisons, size turns out to be such an imprecise thing. And some people will say that a city of 100,000 is a big village. And I had people talking about Płock like that. Or, you know, it can be partly because it seems like you recognize people on the street, everyone knows everyone, or other people think it's a kind of metropolis. And I heard people say, for example, that the place I live in Ukraine is really just like Kalisz, when it was 3 times bigger or 5 times smaller. So, you know, it's all in the eye of the beholder, but size is important because people have identities as people who prefer to live in a big city or maybe a smaller city. If you ask them why, they often say a smaller city like Płock or Kalisz is sort of spokojny, or spokojny in Russian. So it's sort of peaceful. When I wrote a book about small towns in Russia, this was by far the favorite adjective. And I sort of wonder about it. Do people really mean it, or is it just the first thing that comes into their heads when they talk about a smaller place? But there is also a kind of real, I think there is a real meaning about it. And partly it's connected to the concept of stability that I'm going to be mentioning later on. You know, you can sort of come to rest in these places, so you don't have to stress so much. In brackets here, I've put municipal integration policies, because conceivably this could be a feature which differentiates cities, and certainly big cities like Gdańsk or Wrocław have policies to try and encourage and keep migrants and integrate them. You wouldn't expect that in a smaller city with fewer resources, but at the same time there are things going on. Again, I found more in Kalisz than in Płock, but it might be just because of the 2-year gap. So in Kalisz, for example, one quite important thing is those church services I mentioned at the beginning. The fact that the cathedral has been made a place accessible to Ukrainians for their mass, and they have their own priest who came directly from West Ukraine. And he told me that he has very good contacts with all the local authorities, and if people come to him for help, Ukrainians, then he can sort of point them in the right direction to local services. So I think this is a good kind of example of how, you know, some cities can begin to do things. Another example would be where schools had made teaching assistants available to new pupils from Ukraine. So there is some, but not much. Another thing which is clearly important to anybody, not just international migrants, is place attachment, which some people have sort of theorized is definitely related to comparisons that you make. You come to like Kalisz because it reminds you of Lviv, which you already like. You know, so it's like a comparisons. I like it because it's like Lviv, but it's also about simply knowing the place. I know which shops, you know, the ones I want to go to. I feel at home. I don't have to find my way around anymore. I just sort of go automatically to the right shop or the right park or wherever it might be. But on the other hand, some people get bored. Oh, it's too familiar. You know, it's a bit like that quotation I gave you from Galina before, saying, you know, like Poland is just too everyday now. So that of the migration has been lost. Some people distinguished between a place to live and a place to work, a place to relax rather. So particularly in Kalisz, you know, it might be lovely to go to Wrocław or Poznań for the weekend, but you know, if you're going to live, you might as well live in a smaller place, which is more convenient and cheaper. On the other hand, in Płock, people often told me that they really could relax in Płock and go for walks along the Wisła, for example. And I think Płock just probably has more, more opportunities for that. But possibly the final point is most important. It's about social networks. So people come to where they have friends or recommendations quite often, surprisingly often, considering that so many Ukrainians also use networks. I've discussed this quite a lot more in an article of mine, which is going to come out later this year, which is on my bibliography at the end. So I won't say any more. That one is just about Płock. So my next thing I want to talk about is the factories. So here is quotation from Slata. And I'm just going to move something for a moment. So Slata said, I can't say I'm wildly enthusiastic about the job, that I really enjoy it, but for the time being, it's the only option. Okay, so most of my interviewees hadn't worked in factories in Ukraine. They weren't that keen really on factory work, but they could put up with it. And I should say that the top left picture is the actual factory where most of my interviewees in Płock were working, and the one below is where the majority of my interviews in Kalisz were working, but there were several factories in Kalisz. So what is it about factory work which keeps people working there? Well, it's about stability, it seems to a lot of people. I won't read all these quotations, but the same idea in all of them. You know, you get paid at the end of the month, you know that you can afford to buy what you need. So, and in some cases, you know, there is also housing provided. I did just, particularly in like November, December in Kalisz, I began to get intimations that this was beginning to break down a bit because of inflation. So when Ukrainians say they like Poland because it's stable, I think partly they do mean obvious things like it's more secure, there isn't a war, etc. But I think it is also about simply knowing how much their wage will buy. And so inflation is a bit undermining from that point of view. On the other hand, you can't really generalize about all factories. And one of the things that was quite interesting about Kalisz factories was that a lot of the people with higher education in my sample had got promoted. So they weren't actually doing physical work. I mean, you might think a factory worker was doing manual labor. But actually, when I was talking to this particular group of Ukrainians in Kalisz, they had been given supervisorial responsibilities. One woman was about to move into the HR department. They'd been made machine operators, so they were looking at a computer screen. One of them had been made a senior machine operator in order to keep him in the factory. They were doing quite challenging work, some of them, and obviously that was the way of keeping people, at least in the interim. But if they had higher education, mostly they didn't particularly mean to stay working in the factory forever. In Kalisz, because there are a lot of factories in and around Kalisz, it is quite easy to change factory work, and several people have done that. I'm quite happy about it. So that also prolongs their factory career in Kalisz because they can move around between factories. In Płock, it just so happened, thanks indirectly to Michał, who I see is in the audience, so thank you again, where a lot of Ukrainians were living. It was an old student hostel. Some of their Polish workmates lived there if they were from villages outside Płock. So this was a place with really good conditions. People really liked it. They loved the woman who ran it. There was no drinking allowed. It was very safe. And it was good for families. And quite a few people said to me, that's really why we work at the factory in Płock. We don't like the factory very much, but we do like the accommodation. And then some people, particularly women, did think their wages were quite good. And some people were earning, definitely not the Polish minimum wage. On the other hand, there were some factories, particularly the one in Płock, which were really unpleasant. And women were showing me that they had paint in their hair, burns on their arms, and people were exhausted, etc. Płock, there's not so much choice, it seems, of factory work, and certainly you don't work at Orlen, which is too I don't know, but it's difficult apparently to get work there. The other thing that people complained about, some people complained about their wages, particularly if they were working through agencies who were taking a cut. And a lot of people complained about hours, because typically before the pandemic, many people had been able to work for 12 hours. Not everybody, but then often hours had been cut because of the pandemic, and factories were struggling quite a lot sometimes. They had fewer orders and simply there was less work. Yeah, there were definitely different opinions. But another thing I want to talk about with factories, which is the thing I found most interesting, again, this is one of the actual factories, is the way they're what I've called in other places migration hotspots, or maybe like schools of migration. So they are places where lots of people have migration experience, and this includes Poles. So these Polish factory workers set an example of mobility. They help normalise migration livelihoods and encourage migration further west. Okay, so they help people like new arrivals feel that what they've done is completely normal to go abroad to work in a factory. And they also plant ideas in their heads, perhaps, or plant them more firmly that could be quite tempting to try going off to Germany or somewhere else. So, for example, look at this quotation from Ludmila in Płock. At our factory, I know definitely about 10 people who've worked abroad. They went to Holland, Belgium, Germany, One of them, a very old man, was in America, Baltic countries, England, Germany, everywhere. It's different people, young, old, various ages. They get work at the factory in between, so as not to sit idle. They work a bit and go abroad. It's a kind of rotation. We come here and they go there. So that this is a picture of the factory. It's a place which is very mobile, isn't it? Presumably partly because the work is not that tempting for local Poles. For dear in Kalisz, there's an old man in my workplace. He used to work in Germany. He said since he needed to earn some money, he needed to migrate. So so this is like a kind of maxim, isn't it? You know, if you need to earn some money, you have to go abroad. So like there's an old man in the other quotation as well. So these are the people who are setting the example, they're leading the way maybe. This is the education that people are getting when they come to these factories. Some people, I'm not sure about Galina's use of percentages, but she claimed that 95% of the Poles she knew had gone abroad to work. So that, you know, some people at least had a strong sense that a lot of people in their factories had migrated. Other people could only find a few examples, but they all knew that a lot of people locally did migrate. So this obviously helped set the environment in which they were living. On the other hand, of course, these people that they meet are often return migrants. They're people who've come back and think they're now making their home in Poland. But some of them are circular migrants, but some of them are back for good. And you might think these people would say, well, don't migrate. You know, I tried it, I came back. And so I don't know, I think that's part of it. So Tamara talks about her acquaintances at work and also from when she walks her dog. They know I'm from Ukraine, they hear my accent, they say things like, I was in Germany, I worked there for 2 years, or I went to pick blueberries in Holland, or I did this and that. They say, Tamara, there's no place like home. And I say, yes. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't imitate her very well there. I say, yes. She sounded a bit like she was agreeing with them for the sake of politeness. But she came from a war zone in Ukraine, so, you know, she's not going to go back there. So, you know, Doma Lucha, that's what we said in Russian. I think for her, it's not necessarily better, but she politely agreed. And I think what they're doing here, these comments, is that they're trying to find a point they have in common. So they say, oh yes, no, I was a migrant too, as their parallel experiences. Of course, they might be saying, go back to Ukraine. Some people I interviewed had been told that in a very rude way, but not many often. So I think, you know, I don't know, it's unclear. And there's a very interesting article by somebody called Glynn, which compares Italy with Ireland, and talks about how both these countries, when they began to become countries with net immigration, had populations who were very used to emigrating, and they adjusted in different ways, so that the Irish media and officials were encouraging Irish people to draw the connections and be empathetic. Whereas in Italy, there was more of a kind of, you know, sense that, oh, these new arrivals, poor things, you know, it's a bit patronizing. They've come to Italy because Italy is so much better. And obviously both these attitudes are possible, like the real empathy and then a kind of rather patronizing sympathy. And you find both. And so I don't know what you think about this particular quotation. So here, I think this is more, it starts off by being more about this sort of patronizing approach and then becomes more empathetic. So the woman was telling me about how she went to pick blueberries. Tamara, I understand how hard it is for you. You don't understand the language. Pani nie rozumie. But she says, well, I do understand. You know, we're having this conversation in Polish. Home is home, so home is best. There's no place like home. But then she reports another conversation with somebody I think she knows from work. This woman has children and grandchildren in England. So they have these conversations like, how are you? How are you? Your own mother stayed in Ukraine. Do you feel miserable? Yeah, I say, yes, I am miserable. She says, I can't bear it. I miss my grandchildren so badly. Every day I think about my mother. I talk to her every day. Do you do the same? Don't be sad. It's okay. They have their own life there. So you can see how these two women are comforting each other, the daughter and then the mother and grandmother are comforting each other. So I think this is a real case of empathy. So these things happen as well. I want to talk a moment though now about Ukrainians. As you can see, the linguistic landscape is partly in Ukrainian, although not very much. So like advertisements for mortgages, and certainly thoughts about settling were definitely encouraged by the fact that Ukrainians locally were buying flats, and this was particularly noticeable in Kalisz. So we really want to buy a flat here. I know lots of us Ukrainians are buying flats and living here. We want to stay here. We've already made inquiries. Another interviewee, I had an idea of getting a mortgage for my flat. A lot of my friends already have flats. So here you can see that also the local Ukrainian population is causing this tendency to want to settle. People think it's possible to have a mortgage. But so that's the environment. Now, sort of briefly, because I'm aware I'm running out of time, about individuals, and each individual interviewee obviously is different. They have a different bundle of identities. So what about West Ukrainian identity? Is this going to make people more likely to settle in Poland? Well, it might, because the networks are better established. Before 2014, most migration to Poland was from West Ukraine. So people have more, perhaps might have more friends in Poland. Obviously, it's much closer geographically. And Ukrainian speakers, they can simply understand Polish more readily because they have more words in common. But on the other hand, actually, I actually looked at my interviewees. Region didn't seem to be terribly important. As I said before, people make networks so fast nowadays. You know, you can be from somewhere in East Ukraine and have lots of friends in Poland. So networking is, you know, there are networks for everybody. Also, I think near and far are very subjective concepts. Now, there was somebody from Mariupol in East Ukraine saying it was near Poland, and then cheap flights also lessen distance. So that, you know, if you can get to Kharkiv and you live in Kharkiv, you know, by plane, it might actually be much quicker than going to somewhere in Western or Central Ukraine by bus. But it's not about the actual time or the hours, but or the distance, but actually how people feel about it. I think also about Russian speakers. People did seem to feel that they picked up Polish really quickly in terms of listening and speaking. Speaking perhaps not as easy as, well, I mean both. I want to talk about written language later on. So Russian speakers felt reasonably confident. And what was interesting was that in some of those big cities in central and eastern Ukraine, people had already had language lessons before they came, either from returned migrants or from long-established communities of Poles. So being from East or Central Ukraine is not necessarily a handicap. Having Polish roots might well make you more want to settle, and particularly if you have this Karta Polaka, it's very useful, particularly if other migrants are waiting for ages to get residence permit. Obviously, it's also important psychologically. You might have a special feeling of coming home and being at home in Poland, which a few people mentioned to me. But it doesn't always work out like that, does it? And there's plenty of other evidence, for example, about people from former Soviet Union in Germany who are nominally Germans, but they're always called Russians. You know, so people are not necessarily recognized as being Polish in Poland if they come from Ukraine. And also relatives are not necessarily helpful because sometimes it can be quite difficult to contact your relatives and ask them for support if they're rather distant. There was one particularly sad case where somebody had a father in Poland, a Polish father, but since he'd left the family when the son had been a child, the son was very ambivalent about whether to try and find him. And there's also the question about writing Polish, which I really want to emphasize. So even people who can speak Polish quite happily because their father or mother was Polish, can be really shy about writing it. And therefore, if I asked them, like, well, what about citizenship? Well, I don't know. Gender was important in various ways. There is a migration literature saying that women are more inclined to bring over family, which is not surprising, I suppose. And for various reasons also, they're more inclined to settle, whereas men, it seems, often more inclined to return. I haven't really found much evidence about this. As I said, nobody really wanted to return in my sample, apart from one. I did have these incomplete migrants, to use Okulski's terms, so people who had households in Ukraine, and they were the only person in Poland, but most of them were considering staying in Poland with or without their family members. And as I said, most of the Kalisz sample already living as a couple. And men seem to be just as committed as the women to staying in Poland. Perhaps the men were slightly more ready to think about going abroad further west. I think there was a difference that the men were more frustrated about low wages, which reflects the fact that men are supposed to be breadwinners or main breadwinners. And the women were more likely to complain about heavy work, particularly in Płock. Life stage stroke age was very, very important in various ways. Obviously, these intersect with each other. They intersect with other identities as well, like how long people have been in Poland. Like a young person who came like last year may still be very excited about the idea of buying enough money for a car. So earning enough money to buy a car, that's his chief goal, but that same person in 2 years' time may be beginning to think about settling with his girlfriend or something. There's also the kind of history of employment or livelihood strategies in Ukraine, which are very much bound up with their life stage or their age. So one of my favorite interviews was with Padziej. So I tell my friends from Poland in a joking way, I came here to earn money and I thought I was just going to work in a factory. But what if I become a pop star? And no one in Ukraine will believe it. So he had already actually got an invitation for his band to go and perform in a big city in Poland. So it wasn't completely unrealistic. And I must say that among Poles I interviewed, I've interviewed 2 or 3 people who had bands in the UK. So this is not unique. People had different ambitions. Some were very high flying, like banking. Others would be content to be florists. So that, this thing about making your home is also about making a nice career outside the factory, particularly for young people, but not just, because these adult education classes in Kalisz seem to be full of people who were different ages, who were learning things like floristry. The young people, I suppose, were particularly keen to think the future was in their hands. Mobility dreams was somewhat connected to age. So I mean, like onward mobility. Most age groups, not the people with the teenage children who definitely couldn't be moved from their current schools, but younger people without children, people with sort of smallish children who were more portable, or maybe also people whose children were adult. So this was like a kind of typical example. Vadim, who's like young, middle-aged. I came here with my family. We have a son who's gone to school. We want to stay permanently here, but we will change our city. We have nothing to lose and we'll try to make our lives here. Perhaps we'll go a bit further, try out a different country. Why not while we're young? So they were prepared to think about experimenting, and just like Polish people I've interviewed in Poland and the UK, the idea of experimenting, spróbować or popróbować in Russian was very much in the interviews. When I brought up the question of language confidence, this was often when it was a kind of reality check, because people often said, I really couldn't go to Germany because I don't know German. And it was remarkable that even younger people had these inhibitions, and they'd often learned English at school, but they said, when I was at school and I didn't really work at my English, it didn't seem important, and I really regret it now. I didn't learn English properly. So I think language was a kind of check on mobility dreams, just as it was a kind of check on people's dreams of promotion in Poland. People in their 40s and 50s, just as an age group, these people typically had more ties and responsibilities towards people in Ukraine. Even if they were with their children in Poland, they had like older parents, grandchildren, other children had stayed behind in Ukraine. So they did want to stay in Poland, but they could feel anxious and guilty about parents in Ukraine. And they knew that some of those Polish return migrants had returned to look after their parents. One interviewee claimed this was the main reason why Poles returned. He just asserted, the Poles come back to look after their parents. So you can see how this might make people sort of waver a bit about staying in Poland. On the other hand, I said I wouldn't talk about Ukraine, but just very briefly, for women in their 40s and 50s, their livelihood options were very few in Ukraine. On the other hand, it's very often the case that people from Ukraine, these smaller places, as indeed from Poland or Slovakia or other older women do go and work as carers in Italy or Germany. So that was an option. My final point about individuals is their knowledge and confidence in language. It's really hard to measure. I know that obviously people do language exams and so on, but language is so complicated as a sort of social and cultural phenomenon. It is really important for people's identity. Am I a competent person? Do I know Polish well enough to stay? Many people thought the written Polish was important for escaping the factory or just for promotion. Some people want to have a perfect accent. In everyday life, I'm sure that many of us have this experience. Some days we're better at speaking the foreign language than others. We have these horrible times when we're totally incompetent and everything goes wrong. But then, then we have a brilliant encounter where we can speak perfectly and we're quite at home. And I think this does help shape people's views about whether they want to stay. And certainly it came over in my interviews. Everybody was trying to learn Polish, and they were a bit surprised when they talked to Polish people who'd come back from, say, England, and they said, oh, I didn't have to speak any English when I was in England. What, So they did want to learn. I'm talking about factory workers in this presentation. I had construction workers who were much more temporary, who were not trying to learn Polish. As I said before, there was a difference between Russian and Ukrainian speakers, but didn't necessarily help with writing. Almost everybody was worried about it, and I could go on and on about this. I will do in another context. What people said, which was quite cheering, was that on the whole, Poles were pretty helpful to them about understanding their mistakes and things and helping them out. And in Płock, it was really fascinating that several people claimed that older people who knew Russian were prepared to speak it to Ukrainians, which quite surprised me. As somebody who lived in Poznań in the 1980s when people hated speaking Russian. So yes, so it is really, really complicated, that topic. Anyway, just to conclude, so Poland's migration transition is in its second stage. Very quickly come to the second stage, so that this second stage is when people live in lots of different places in the country, in the receiving country, and they bring over their families. And it's not just that these are statistics, but also ordinary people, ordinary migrants have an awareness of these trends, and they help shape their thoughts about what to do. Like, other Ukrainians are getting a mortgage, so I'm going to try as well. However, even if they're geographically dispersed, they may be socially or institutionally quite concentrated, and some Polish research also shows this, so that there are particular Polish people who are more likely to know Ukrainians from their workplace and factories of one such place. And since these factories are already migration hotspots, where there are quite a few Polish former migrants or circular migrants, they're a place of rich migration culture where people can swap stories about migration and about return. So the factory is quite an important kind of locus, as it were. To some extent, Ukrainians are made to feel at home in Poland and therefore to want to stay because they encounter empathy. But I think that sometimes they just find a kind of sympathy or not even really sympathy, but simply to make conversation. People say, oh, you know, I was a migrant too. But then they draw parallels which are completely false, like, oh, you don't understand Polish, pani nie rozumie, you know, which obviously completely stupid, but these say this is just the way people talk. So there is some empathy, but you know, I'm not going to even try and measure it. But it is important that it's there, and it does help explain why people might want to stay. And I love the example of the woman who is talking to her colleague about grandparents in the other country. I think the final point I want to make is simply that there's a lot of mobility nowadays, and Ukrainians know that they live in a geographically mobile society. Mobility is an acceptable livelihood strategy. It's normal, and this helps shape their futures because they simply understand that, you know, that it's just normal. And that's what you can do. And that's what they want to try and do. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Oh, sorry, I should stop the screen, but I do have some references. Sorry, just a minute. So just come back to it. Here we are, sorry. Can you see it? Okay, and then I do have some references. So, yeah. Okay. So, okay.
It's okay. We don't see the. I don't see the references.
Did you not see them? I sorry, I just took them off. I just quickly removed them. Sorry. Do you want them again? Maybe if somebody asks me, I'll put them up.
Yeah. So thank you for this very, very interesting talk with so many details about migration culture of Ukrainians, with so many also ethnographic details. So for me, it was extremely interesting. So I think now I ask our audience to either raise a hand or to write the questions in the chat box, and we can have, I hope, a nice discussion of the situation.
Isa, will you chair the discussion?
Yes.
Right.
So we have one comment, which is on the chat from Sara Dobrzańska. I live and work in Kalisz actually, and agree with a lot of what you say and what the people you interview with.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. That's so lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, I also know some people that hire Ukrainians.
Okay.
And they are satisfied. I know also some workplaces that hire Ukrainians. I've heard about people getting promoted, but also there are some companies, big companies, that they have some problems, or they don't hire any foreigners. So there's we have that too. But I think that's mainly the business with airplanes and something like military or something like that. So it's because of that. Yeah, and I have a friend that hires also Ukrainians in picking chives, yeah, the greeny thing of the onions. So yeah, and he's very pleased with them. We had some issues with the procedure of hiring any of the foreigners in some kind of forms, but yeah, I think it will get better in some time.
Yeah. Oh, Sarah, would you mind? Could you send me an email? I would love to be in touch with you if that's okay.
Yes, of course, no problem. On the chat?
No. Sorry, write to me. Just write to me separately if you don't mind. And then you can find me on Google or somewhere. And then perhaps we can talk about it later on. That'd be really good.
No problem. I will try to find where to put it. Where to?
Oh, all right. Well, that's right. But anyway, don't worry about it for the moment, because you maybe not want to share your email with everyone. But maybe you could just write me an email.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry, but I think I'm not visible, even though my camera should be working. I see Helena Pater, who wants to ask a question. So please do unmute your microphone. Yeah.
Thank you, Isa. I hope we'll see you as well in a moment. But for now, your black screen. Anne, thank you very much for the great lecture and for your presentation of the research. It's a very fascinating case when you're looking at this reverse side of migration when Poland is becoming a migration country very speedily, as you say. My question would be, you have mentioned different aspects when the new migrants, Ukrainians here, are visible somehow in the city space, meaning, of course, taking up different places like the church, like some squares, but also on billboards written in Ukrainian. So I would be interested, do you see a conscious effort on the side of the cities, these municipalities, certain administrative units to actually create a space for these incoming migrants? Do you see some kind of, changing the language, maybe putting some signs in Ukrainian, or is it rather something that just happens on behalf of private companies, or the church as a place where often migrants gather, but there is no effort? Because from what is visible from different research in Poland, there hasn't been much effort on the side of the local governments, but also the central government to accustom to the migrants. Yes, it's rather a kind of unwelcoming space. Yes, they have to manage on their own. So how does it look in these cities?
Well, no, I agree with you that there's not very much in Ukrainian. There is in the post office, there's stuff about transferring money. There is obviously the factories are extremely important to the Ukrainian workers. So the fact that factories are making a big effort is important to them. But other things, no, I mean, it's mostly it's either Polish or English. And when I was talking to people who were like other foreigners who spoke English, they found it no problem at all to get things done in English. For example, I interviewed an Italian who, time the interview, he'd just come from doing his dealings in the local town hall, and he'd done everything in English. So it was fine, so this gets like, Kasia Andrzejczyk's research, for example, about West Europeans and how they find things in Poland. There are lots of accommodation to them, but it's harder if you're Ukrainian. So they didn't complain about it, though, I have to say. They certainly didn't complain. Nobody said to me we would have liked things to be in Ukrainian. And there was a very strong ethic of learning Polish among his factory workers I interviewed. I think that was important. The other thing is with one exception, I never interviewed people who'd only arrived very recently. So there were people who had learned to read Polish at least a bit, which does make a difference. So just to go back to what you were saying at the beginning, just from my observation, as far as I could observe, then there doesn't seem to be much written in Ukrainian around the place.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's also something which is changing, but we observed that also in the suburbs of Warsaw, and how that actually there's not much accommodating to any language. It's rather on the side of the private companies, maybe private kindergartens, when it can appear with Ukrainian, English, or Hindi, but not really much effort on the side of the local government. So thank you very much.
Thank you. There is, unfortunately, my camera is not up. There is another question from, I think, Ann Popik or Angelina Popik. I don't see your first name, so please unmute and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. My name is Angelica. Thank you, and for the presentation and for the topic, for being interested in that. I just have two questions and comments. The first one is that, there is the kind of debate in Poland about the temporality and transitionality of Polish labor migrants, Ukrainian labor migrants in Poland. And what I observe about the labor migration from Ukraine among my acquaintances, people that I know from Ukraine, is that two key issues that help them stay in Poland or want them to stay in Poland. That first one is the fair treatment at the workplace. What I mean is that comparing to Poles being employed and Ukrainians. If there is a fair employment conditions that helps them to stay, understanding that they are valued, that's one thing. And also, of course, salary and agreement, the fair agreement, not that the high salary is, of course it is matter, but the type of agreement. That's how the employee treats seriously or not, respects or not the employees. And of course, you were talking about the mortgages and about getting loans for flats, which is getting extremely popular among Ukrainian migrants, and not only Ukrainian. I know a lot of other ethnic groups, like for example, Turkish migrants, who are getting a lot of mortgages right now. But to be able to get the loan in a bank, you have to have the permanent agreement and stable salary. So if that condition will be fulfilled, probably people will start getting loans, and if they get loans, they will have more responsibilities and permanency of staying here, bringing their families here. That's one issue. And the other, something that you already brought up, is the language issue. And I also observed that a lot of private companies, communication companies, try to provide information in Ukrainian, which is, of course, a tactic and it's nice. But what I see among the migrants, they don't really need the information in Ukrainian. They need a support in learning Polish. So if they know Polish on a basic communicative level, and enough level for them not to be afraid and shamed to speak Polish, they feel a kind of attached to the place already. And then maybe they will consider moving here and there. Say they have a lot of migration experience. It's not that they come to Poland. Some people came to Poland for the first time. Some people come to Poland many times here and there, or they go to other countries and they compare. So if they have a kind of attachment, so language becomes the belonging point for them, the attachment point for them. So just my thoughts for example, for policymakers. So to be able to stabilize migration and not let the migrants go further or return to Ukraine, you can just provide minimum of language courses, and I think that will be useful. Thank you.
I completely agree, and particularly people who need to learn to write Polish confidently. It seems to me that's completely central to a lot of people's lives. I love your points, thank you. They're all very, very important. About fair employment, I agree. If I'd had more time, I would have talked about that. Some people are convinced, not necessarily on the basis of evidence, that Polish people get paid more than Ukrainians, and those people feel less at home. But quite a few people made the point very strongly to me that they work in the factory on completely equal terms to Poles, and then one person told me about a factory where he worked, where some Polish person had made some sort of comment about Ukrainians and actually been fined by the factory, and he was really pleased about that because he felt that the factory was sticking up for the rights of Ukrainians. So this idea of being fairly treated and respected is really important. And one of the things which always strikes me about this is that when I've interviewed Polish people who went to the West, like to the UK, particularly, I suppose, maybe the UK and Ireland, often they made this same point to me, that we feel our work is respected. It's partly about the attitudes at workplaces, but it's also about getting a decent wage and being able to also, as you say, to go on to having a permanent contract or an open-ended contract. And again, people did make that point to me very strongly, that they were so pleased that they'd got that contract. And if they had it, then that was a very important aspect of their integration. I completely agree with what you say about how what the languages that you speak are part of your identity, and they do help you feel at home. I guess that, it's definitely in home. It definitely makes you feel much more comfortable, doesn't it? Particularly if you can pick up a language fairly quickly and feel really proud of yourself for learning it so well, which was the case of quite a few of my interviews. Thank you.
Okay, there is another question from Kuba Jabłonowski, so please unmute.
Hello, It's really good to be here. I'm Kuba Błonowski from the University of Exeter, but long time ago I studied in Poznań at the Department of Social Anthropology. I don't recognize any of the names on the call. This is how long ago it was, but it made me feel a little bit nostalgic listening to this presentation. So possibly my question is framed by that. I was really interested in this interplay between immigration and emigration in the title of the paper. But it seems to me kind of refer it to the country squarely. So Poland is the country of immigration and migration. And I was wondering, because in my work, I tried to take it to the sort of individual level. So I think in migration studies, we quite often like to see or tend to see, especially in the West, migrants as people who arrive rather than as people who left somewhere. I was wondering, you know, and throughout the talk, you actually mentioned there's quite a few moments where the experience of having left Ukraine, the experience of being Ukrainian really mediates the experience in Poland. So for example, when people talk about those cities that they arrived to and you say, you know, they're completely different size, but probably the vibe is similar. And this is why they kind of say, oh, it's like home. So I wanted to ask that, whether you sort of in your analytical work, whether you kind of distinguish that, you know, people who arrived versus people who left, and whether you sort of think about those immigrants in Ukraine, to most people in Poland, they would be immigrants, also as immigrants, as kind of as people who have those sort of histories that inform and mediate their experience in Poland, their decisions. And so on. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's a very selfish question because the talk is hosted from Poznań.
Thank you. Okay, so do you mean that you asked me to comment on how their Ukrainian experiences shaped their thoughts about settling in Poland?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's like sort of half of my research project. I couldn't do it in a couple of moments, but I'm clearly they're constantly referring to that in their everyday. Well, I don't know. How much do people think about it? Of course, the interview setting is completely artificial. The way my interviews proceed is that I ask them at the beginning to tell me about like why they came to Kalisz or Płock, and then they sort of tell their migration story, and then I spend quite a long time asking them about their life in Ukraine. And then we go on to their life in Poland, and then like their sort of thoughts about the future. But it's not necessarily that structured, and we're always sort of returning to Ukraine because things become important at various stages. Like I like it in Poland because it's not like Ukraine, or I might have to go back because my mother isn't very well, or you know, that sort of thing. So my perspective as a scholar has definitely been to see the sending and the receiving countries hand in hand, and that's all my research is like that. And I'm very, very conscious of Ukraine as a player here, and you know, I don't know, have been to Ukraine, I have Ukrainian roots, etc. So for me, it's important. It is important on all sorts of levels, the Ukrainian side of it. But unfortunately, I haven't done any field work there, but that would be the next thing to do. So but at the same time, you know, there are like two other things to say about this. One is in people's everyday lives, I think some individuals are thinking more about Ukraine than others are. So obviously there are people like who, you know, they like the woman who is phoning her mother every day. So they've got Ukraine constantly fixed in their head, and people they know in Ukraine. So those transnational ties are very strong. The transnational social space is very active. But there are other people who don't. You know, so they're in Poland, and they're just individuals in Poland, and they don't particularly have strong transnational ties. And I think all the migration scholarship shows that, you know, it's a very individualized kind of thing, as he was saying. So for some people, maybe Ukraine is no longer so important. It is very individualized. I could go on, but I see that other people have got questions to ask. So thank you for your question anyway.
There are also three comments which are there for a long time, so maybe first I'm going to read those comments, and then Professor Michał Grabowski. So first there is a comment from Sonia Lipolis. I didn't get completely the part about the language. Is it for Ukrainians easier to learn Polish instead of German or Italian? Thanks.
Yes, okay. Oh yes, much easier, because a lot of the words and the whole structure of the language is really, really similar. They're very close. It'd be like sort of Italian and Spanish, to draw a very vague. I'm sure, so the linguists among you are probably not going to like that but it's like they are very much cognate languages. So if you're a Ukrainian, you can come to Poland and you can already begin to guess some of the things that you see written around you, and then over a very short space of time, you probably will begin to understand some of the things that people are saying to you. So it's sort of economical from that point of view, but then there comes this awful moment when you realise you have to write and you don't know how to do it. So yeah, that's the problem.
Okay, and there is a comment from Daria Krivonos. Thank you so much, Anne, for such a rich presentation. Do you think that a common understanding of migration as an acceptable livelihood strategy may influence Poles' attitudes towards Ukrainian migrants?
Yeah.
Do you suggest that a common experience of migration may generate more sympathy towards Ukrainians? Thank you very much. Okay,
so I think it does. For me, I realised a couple of months ago, these are very different things, and I think it's very important. So what is definitely true, I think, is that a lot of people who are very familiar with migration, Poles, have a very pragmatic attitude towards it. You go abroad to earn money, you need to do that, and let's not moralise about it and say it's unpatriotic. Okay, so clearly some people have different ideas, but there are a lot of Polish people who have that very pragmatic idea. And so constantly in my interviews, people are saying things like, oh, we go to Poland because we need to earn money, and Poles go abroad because they need to earn money, So those equivalences are there. So it encourages people to think that's just normal, as I said. The idea of sympathy is a different matter, I think. And here, this is where I was trying to distinguish between sympathy and empathy. So empathy being that you actually really can put yourself in the shoes of the person you're talking to. And then sympathy, which may be more sort of superficial. And as I said, I can't really measure it at all, but I can find examples of both. So, I do, like when people say, oh, I met this Polish woman, she said, I do feel sorry for you Ukrainians because you're so far from home. That's like sympathy, which might be a bit off-putting in some ways, or might be wonderful, But then when people say, oh, I spoke to my mother today, when did you last talk to your grandchildren? So that's really like a kind of, if you think about contact theory, when do people learn to live together from different backgrounds? One of the criteria is that they should be on an equal footing. So when somebody meets somebody else and they're on an equal footing, like equally separated from close members of their family, they can reach out to each other and they can, help each other, and they can feel at home. So I think that does go on, but obviously that's not the whole story because other things go on as well. Does that answer your question? Sorry. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, good.
Michał Buchowski, yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Three short questions. First, about numbers. You made studies in Płock, Kalisz, and you plan to go to Piła. What about the proportion of this migrant population you want to study? Because as far as I know, for instance, the number of immigrants in Poznań, it makes it up to 10%. Is it the same in Kalisz or in Płock, or what about what numbers do we speak? I mean, I know that it's qualitative study, but it would be nice to know.
Yeah, okay, so various numbers, people do produce various numbers, but it's very difficult to say, not surprisingly, because the question is what those numbers refer to. They refer to the city, or when Poznań, obviously they refer to the city, but often the numbers you can get in other places, refer to powiat or wherever, or it might be that people living in one place, but working outside the city boundaries. So for example, as somebody mentioned, I think it was Sarah mentioned, like people who are picking chives. So there are a lot of people in Kalisz who are bussed out to work in greenhouses outside Kalisz, and Płock even more, because Płock, there are places near Płock which have got like almost the highest concentrations of Ukrainians in the whole of Poland. So if you take into account those agricultural workers, then it's like huge numbers, some of whom will be in the city. But it's not. I mean, I don't know. I mean, how can you take? I don't know. I understand where you're coming from. All I can say is that is that numbers are extraordinarily unreliable because of all sorts of things we know about statistics about Ukrainians, not least the fact that people come and go. So it would be very interesting to have some numbers about, for example, the number of Ukrainian children at schools or the number of Ukrainian people having mortgages, for example, which would be very good to indicators of settlement, but I don't have any numbers like that.
Because this would also somehow contribute to the note of Michał Nowosielski, yeah, because that local authorities in Płock do not see a problem. That migrants are outside of their radars. Well, because if the number is very small, then maybe it is so. But if the number is 10 or 20% of labor force, then of course it has to come into a radar of the authorities. I mean, not only anthropologists.
No, but I mean, people do have these ideas about numbers. So, like, several people said to me, "Oh, I've heard that there are 17,000 Ukrainians in Kalisz," or the priest, in fact, said to me, "There are 17,000 Ukrainians in Kalisz." Clearly, there can't be, but once you start taking into account people in the surrounding area, then then there might be, if you think about the number of people who are working in picking tomatoes or whatever it might be. So yeah, I mean, they do. People have that. I mean, I think there's also a question of language you hear on the street, isn't there? So in Płock, when I was doing research there in 2019, you didn't hear that much Ukrainian. Occasionally you did, but being in Kalisz, actually, I could go out almost every day. I would hear somebody speaking Ukrainian on the street. So I think that you get that impression from that. In places like Poznań, there's also like whole sort of stuff about restaurants and things like that, and you get people serving you in public places or whatever. Whereas I think in both Płock and Kalisz, Ukrainians often are just sort of working away in factories, so that they're not necessarily so visible if they're not driving. I don't know. I should stop waffling because I've never taken a taxi, for example. So maybe Sarah knows better.
If I can hop in for just a minute. I work in a job office, and we have we work once a year. We do like a report on migrations from Ukraine and some other countries, and we work on statistics, so we know like in what powiat we have how many foreigners working here in which sector or something like that.
I have. Do you mean like the Usian pracy?
Yes.
Okay. So I do have some statistics like that.
Yeah.
I'm saying that you can't. Right, well, I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. It's another. You would definitely stay in touch.
I also wanted to ask this question similar to Daria's one, but maybe in your interviews, have you found some hints that the attitude of people who have this migration experience are more sympathetic towards these immigrants than the people who do not have this migrant experience?
No, because I'm not comparing those groups, because my interviewees are only people who have migration experience, or in a couple of cases, they're very close relatives of people who live abroad. Okay, so I couldn't compare them with the, as it were, ordinary population, although there aren't that many Polish people who've got absolutely no contact with migration. But the people, definitely there is something about having a lot of migration experience, and particularly recent experience, which does put you in a particular category. So that is really my puzzle. Obviously, it would be really interesting to do that kind of research about whether to do a big survey about it, but that's not what I do.
So that means that you also do not have this comparative overview.
No.
But also with regard to other groups, let's say Belarusians, or whether there are networks of immigrants based on language. For instance, people coming from the former Soviet Union who know Russian, and the attitudes toward them, whether people also have different attitudes toward Belarusians and Russians, or Ukrainians or Georgians, etc.
Well, I can't really say about that either. I mean, I do have a few Belarusians in my sample, and I have a Russian as well. And obviously people did make comments about whether they thought that Polish people were keen on people speaking Russian or not. But overall, I was surprised by how many people seemed to think that wasn't a problem, and that in fact people were quite friendly and tried to speak Russian to them, which I hadn't really expected at all.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any more questions? So maybe I give you some time to think about questions, and I have one which I would really like to ask, because you mentioned the adult education classes.
Okay, yes.
It's a big theme in Poznań, because it's also a way to make to get the residence card faster or easier as a student.
Yes.
And work at the same time, and also to be able to get the certificate of the school.
Yes.
When the teaching is conducted in Polish
Yes.
means that they don't have to take the language exam.
Yes.
When people apply for the permanent residency.
Yeah.
So I wonder, and in Poland, in Poznań, it's quite a big market and quite many schools. With also the state subsidy. Is it the case also in Kalisz and Płock?
Yeah, well, nobody mentioned this to me in Płock, and I very much doubt if they were doing it, partly because of the sort of hours that they were working and all the rest of it. In Kalisz, some people were younger people without dependents, or there were also some people I interviewed who were not factory workers, like people who worked in a beauty salon, for example. And so overall, there were a handful of people who were taking these courses. The thing about the language was mentioned to me as being very important. So the people who had managed to stick with the courses and were able to take notes in Polish and so forth were very proud of themselves and definitely very, very committed to continuing with the course. I was told that there was a course where most of the Ukrainians had dropped out because they couldn't cope with doing that, taking notes in Polish. And so they started, obviously thinking it would be a very good investment of their time, but then they hadn't managed to see it through to the end. And they are subsidized, they don't have to pay any fees. So it is clearly very tempting for Ukrainians, and the word must be getting around on the grapevine that it's something you can do. Because I was told that like, there were classes which were, where the majority of the students were Ukrainian.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any more questions. I don't know if everybody was able to read the comment of Michał Nowosielski, because I know that not everybody has access to the chat. So maybe I would just read it as a final point for you if you want to comment that in the case of Płock, it is clear that the city neither has an integration policy, strategy, nor sees a need to establish one. And in fact, in my opinion, they do not notice the problem. And yeah, so was it also your conclusion from your talks with local people?
Yeah, I've talked to Michał about this on several occasions. Yes. Okay. So yeah, I mean, in Płock, I mean, it's really interesting, Michał, and I mean, we ought to have a conversation about this now, because clearly, there's this 2-year gap. So I feel diffident about generalizing about Płock when I was there last in September 2019. But definitely there was, yeah, people just didn't even talk about it. I mean, from what I did try and interview, I did talk to various people, like teachers and people at the employment centre and so forth, various people, sort of experts, as it were, in Płock, and I had exactly that impression, of course. But I mean, Michał lives in Płock and is very well connected, so he's the real expert here. I wouldn't be likely to contradict him. I definitely didn't have any evidence to the contrary. But looking at it from the point of view, from sort of bottom-up point of view, from the point of view of the individuals, it is striking that like a lot of migrants, I suppose this is not just Ukrainians in Poland, but they are quite individualistic, and they somehow don't necessarily expect to have a lot of support from the state or whatever, and they could use it. And it would be good if they had it. Clearly, the local authorities have a kind of duty to provide it, but somehow they don't. I don't know. They have this feeling of being dependent on their informal networks, which is very striking.
Okay, thank you. So thank you to all of you for participation, and thank you, Anne, for this very inspiring talk. And I think we all learned a lot. We had a lot of new things to to analyze and to think about and to maybe compare with other locations as well. Thank you to all the participants, to people who asked the questions. Thank you, Marta, for helping with technicalities. And I invite you all to the next webinar, which will be again in a month's time in February, and you can see the announcement about it on our webpage and also on Facebook. So I wish you a good midday, good afternoon, and hope to see you during our next meeting. And thank you again, and once more for this wonderful talk. Goodbye.